Today we will explore one of the horrifying chapters, the Vietnam War. A war that US history will never forget. A war that surpassed the measures of atrocities committed by both sides. The story starts when Vietnam was under French colonial rule, which found itself at the center of a tug-of-war between competing ideologies after World War II. The French sought to reassert their colonial control over Vietnam. However, they faced fierce resistance from the Viet Minh, a nationalist and communist movement led by Ho Chi Minh. The First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954, ensued, culminating in the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where the Viet Minh defeated the French forces. This victory led to the 1954 Geneva Accords, which temporarily divided Vietnam into North and South, with the promise of nationwide elections to reunify the country. However, these elections never occurred, and the division solidified. The Cold War climate of the 1950s set the stage for the United States to become increasingly involved in Vietnam. The US government, driven by the domino theory, the idea that the fall of one country to communism would lead to the spread of communism throughout the region, began to support the anti-communist government in South Vietnam. This support initially took the form of financial and military aid, but gradually escalated into direct military involvement. By 1964, the situation had deteriorated. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which US naval vessels were allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese forces, prompted Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This resolution gave President Lyndon B. Johnson the authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war, marking the official beginning of large-scale US involvement. As the conflict escalated, the Vietnam War became a dilemma, with no clear front lines and an enemy that was often invisible. The US military, equipped with superior firepower and technology, found itself at a disadvantage against the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army. Dense jungles, unfamiliar terrain, and the constant threat of ambushes created a nightmarish environment for American soldiers. One of the most harrowing aspects of the war was the widespread use of napalm and Agent Orange by US forces. Napalm, a jelly-like substance that sticks to the skin and burns intensely, was used to destroy enemy positions and clear vegetation. However, its use often resulted in horrific civilian casualties. One of the most famous images from the war, that of a young Vietnamese girl running naked down a road after being severely burned by napalm, became a symbol of the war's brutality. Agent Orange, a chemical defoliant, was used to strip the dense jungles of their foliage, depriving the Viet Cong of cover. However, the chemical had devastating long-term effects on both the Vietnamese population and American soldiers. Exposure to Agent Orange has been linked to a range of health problems, including cancer, birth defects, and other serious conditions. The full extent of the damage caused by Agent Orange is still being felt today. The war also saw the widespread use of booby traps and improvised explosive devices by the Viet Cong. These traps, often made from simple materials like bamboo spikes, were designed to maim rather than kill, creating a psychological burden for US soldiers who had to constantly be on guard. The fear of stepping on a hidden mine or falling into a pit of sharpened stakes added to the constant stress and anxiety experienced by those on the ground. The Vietnam War was a conflict of staggering human cost, with casualties on both sides reaching horrific levels. According to estimates, the war resulted in the deaths of over 2 million Vietnamese civilians, along with more than 1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters. On the American side, over 58,000 US military personnel lost their lives, with hundreds of thousands more wounded, both physically and psychologically. The war also took a severe toll on the mental health of those who fought in it. Many American soldiers returned home with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that was poorly understood at the time. The horrors of combat, combined with the guilt of killing civilians and witnessing the deaths of comrades, left deep psychological scars that many veterans struggled with for the rest of their lives. In his memoir, If I Die in a Combat Zone, Vietnam veteran and author Tim O'Brien recounts the emotional turmoil he experienced during and after the war. He states, "What sticks to memory, often, are those odd little fragments." He writes, "I remember the monotony, digging foxholes, slapping mosquitoes, the sun and heat and endless paddies. Even in the deep bush, where you could die any number of ways, the war was still routine. The Vietnam War was marked by a series of atrocities and war crimes committed by both sides. Perhaps the most infamous of these is the My Lai massacre, in which US soldiers killed between 347 and 504 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and the elderly, on March 16, 1968. The My Lai massacre was initially covered up by the US military, but the story eventually came to light, leading to widespread outrage and a deepening of the anti-war movement in the United States. The massacre became a symbol of the moral quagmire that the Vietnam War had become, and it raised serious questions about the conduct of American forces in the conflict. In addition to the My Lai massacre, there were numerous other incidents of violence against civilians, including the use of free fire zones, where soldiers were permitted to shoot anything that moved, regardless of whether it posed a threat. The dehumanization of the enemy, coupled with the stress and fear of combat, led some soldiers to commit acts of violence that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. On the other side, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces also committed atrocities, including the mass execution of civilians suspected of collaborating with the enemy. The Tet Offensive of 1968, a major turning point in the war, saw the Viet Cong launch surprise attacks on cities and towns across South Vietnam. In the city of Hue, the Viet Cong executed thousands of civilians and prisoners of war, burying them in mass graves. These brutal tactics were part of a broader strategy to destabilize the South Vietnamese government and break the will of the American public. The Vietnam War has been extensively documented through the voices of those who lived through it. Soldiers on both sides shared harrowing experiences that capture the complexity and horror of the conflict. In his book, Dispatches, war correspondent Michael Hare provides a raw, unfiltered account of the war from the perspective of the soldiers on the ground. Hare writes, "We'd all heard so many lies by then that when we found one that wasn't a lie, we were astonished. We couldn't handle it. You'd see something truly evil, and just when you'd think it was going to crest like a wave and break over you, it'd veer off, slide past, and you were left feeling the same as you had before, stunned and empty." The sense of disillusionment and moral ambiguity that Hare describes was a common theme among soldiers who fought in Vietnam. Many entered the war with a sense of duty and patriotism, only to find themselves questioning the purpose of the conflict and the ethics of their actions. Vietnamese soldiers, too, experienced the war in deeply personal and painful ways. In The Sorrow of War, a novel by North Vietnamese veteran Bao Ninh, the protagonist reflects on the devastating impact of the war on his life and the lives of those around him. "The war was over, but my soul was still broken," he writes. "I returned home, but nothing was the same. The land, the people, even the air seemed different. I felt like a ghost, wandering through a world that no longer existed." Bao Ninh's words shows the sentiments of many who survived the war. Regardless of which side they fought on, the conflict left deep scars on the Vietnamese people, with entire villages destroyed, families torn apart, and a generation traumatized by the violence they witnessed. The Vietnam War officially ended on April 30th, 1975, when North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The city was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and Vietnam was reunified under communist rule. For the United States, the end of the war marked a humiliating defeat, with the fall of Saigon symbolizing the failure of US intervention in Vietnam. The war's legacy, however, extends far beyond the borders of Vietnam. In the United States, the Vietnam War had an impact on the national psyche, leading to widespread distrust of the government and a reevaluation of U.S. foreign policy. The war also left a lasting imprint on American culture, influencing everything from literature and film to music and art. For Vietnam, the war resulted in enormous physical and psychological devastation. The country faced the daunting task of rebuilding in the aftermath of a conflict that had claimed millions of lives and destroyed much of its infrastructure. The long-term effects of the war on Vietnam's environment and public health have also been severe. The extensive use of Agent Orange and other chemicals during the war led to widespread deforestation and contamination of the soil and water. Even decades after the war's end, the legacy of these toxic substances continues to affect the health of the Vietnamese people, with increased rates of cancer, birth defects, and other serious conditions being reported in affected areas. In the United States, the Vietnam War became a powerful symbol of the dangers of military interventionism and the limits of American power. The war sparked a significant anti-war movement, which brought together a diverse coalition of activists, students, and veterans who opposed the conflict. The protests against the Vietnam War played a crucial role in shaping public opinion and ultimately contributed to the U.S. government's decision to withdraw its forces from Vietnam. Hope you now understand the dark history of Vietnam and its long-term effects. If you like watching such videos, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel by clicking the right circle, and check out the left video to explore more such dark chapters of history.